The symphony hall looked even bigger empty than it did during concerts. Margaret stood on the stage staring out at rows and rows of red velvet seats. Somewhere up in the balcony she could see Maestro Chen sitting with two other judges. Their faces were too far away to read, her hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs, willing them to be still. She had practiced for 2 weeks straight. She knew this piece backward and forward. But standing here in this place where real musicians performed, she felt like a fraud. "Whenever you're ready," Maestro Chen's voice echoed through the empty hall. Margaret sat down at the Steinway Concert Grand. It was the most beautiful piano she had ever seen, let alone played. She adjusted the bench, positioned her feet, placed her hands on the keys. Took a breath and then she played. The first notes came out tentative, uncertain. She could hear the fear in them. But as the piece progressed, as she lost herself in the music, the fear began to fade. Her hands remembered what her mind had forgotten. They knew where to go, how to move, how to pull emotion from ivory and wood. She played the entire concerto, all 3 movements. It took 35 minutes. When she finished, her hands were cramping and her back was screaming. But she had done it. She had made it through without any major mistakes. The silence that followed felt eternal. Margaret sat at the piano, not daring to look up at where the judges sat. She heard footsteps, someone walking down the aisle. Then Maestro Chen was on the stage with her and he was smiling. "Welcome back," he said simply. Margaret got the position. The symphony announced it 2 days later, and the local newspaper picked up the story. Former concert pianist returns after decade of cleaning houses. The headline made her wince, but the article itself was kind. It told her story with sympathy and respect. The phone started ringing. Old colleagues who had lost touch reached out. Students she had taught decades ago sent messages of support. A local television station wanted to interview her. She said no to most of it. She wasn't ready for that kind of attention yet. She needed to focus on the performance that was now less than 6 months away. She quit her job with the Harrisons. Mrs. Harrison understood, even seemed relieved. She paid Margaret for 6 months of work in advance, calling it a severance package even though Margaret hadn't asked for it. "It's the least I can do," Mrs. Harrison said. After everything, Margaret quit her other cleaning jobs too. With the money Mrs. Harrison had given her, and the small stipend the symphony provided during rehearsal periods, she could afford to focus entirely on music for the first time in 10 years. It felt like stepping out of a dark room into sunlight, disorienting and wonderful at the same time. She practiced 6 hours a day. The piano dealer checked in regularly, bringing tools to keep the Yamaha in perfect tune. The music academy owner started inviting her to have tea in her office after practice sessions just to talk. Slowly, Margaret began to build a community again. Musicians and teachers and people who understood what music meant, what it could do to a person's life. Maestro Chen was patient with her during rehearsals with the orchestra. The first time she played with the full ensemble, she was so nervous she made mistakes she hadn't made since she was a teenager. But he never got frustrated, never made her feel inadequate. "You're remembering how to fly," he told her. "Be patient with yourself." 3 months before the performance, Margaret finally answered one of the interview requests. A journalist from the City magazine wanted to do a feature story. Margaret agreed, but only if they could do it at the Symphony Hall at the piano. She felt more comfortable there now than anywhere else. The journalist was a young woman named Lisa, probably in her late 20s. She set up a recording device and pulled out a notebook. "I've read the basic facts of your story," she said, "but I want to understand the human part of it. What was it like giving up music?" Margaret thought about it for a long moment. "It was like holding my breath for 10 years, she finally said. Like walking around with a piece of myself missing. I told myself it was necessary, that I had to be practical. But every time I passed a piano in a window, every time I heard classical music playing in a store, it hurt. It physically hurt, and now I can breathe again," Margaret smiled. "It's terrifying and wonderful, and I don't know if I deserve this second chance. But I'm taking it anyway." The article came out 2 weeks later with photos of Margaret at the piano, looking contemplative and strong. The headline read, "The Maid Who Never Stopped Being a Musician." It went viral online. Suddenly, everyone knew her story. Ticket sales for the concert exploded. The symphony had to open up additional seating sections. People were calling from other cities, asking if the performance would be recorded. Maestro Chen was thrilled. Margaret was terrified. 1 month before the performance, David Harrison showed up at the Symphony Hall. Margaret was taking a break between rehearsals when the stage manager told her someone was asking to see her. She found David waiting in the lobby, looking uncomfortable in jeans and a sweater. His usual arrogance was gone. "I know you probably don't want to see me," he said immediately, "but I needed to come. I've been thinking about that night for months now." Margaret crossed her arms. "What about it?" "I was cruel. I was drunk and bored, and I thought it would be funny to humiliate you. I didn't think of you as a real person with feelings and history and talent. I thought of you as entertainment." He looked at the floor. "I've been volunteering at a homeless shelter, serving food, cleaning up, doing the work that I used to think was beneath me. And every single person there has a story, has dreams they had to give up, talents they lost, lives that didn't go the way they planned." Margaret felt her anger softening slightly. "That's good, David. That's growth. I bought a ticket to your concert," he said. "Orchestra section. I hope that's okay. I want to be there. I want to see you shine the way you were always meant to shine." Margaret looked at this young man who had accidentally changed her life by trying to humiliate her. "It's okay. You can come." The night of the performance finally arrived. Margaret stood backstage in a borrowed concert gown, dark blue with subtle beading that caught the light. Someone had done her hair and makeup. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. Through the curtain, she could hear the audience taking their seats. The hall was sold out. Over 2,000 people had come to hear her play. The thought made her dizzy. Maestro Chen found her in the green room. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm going to throw up," he laughed. "That's normal. That means you care. Use that energy, channel it into the music." The orchestra was already on stage, warming up. Margaret peeked through the curtain and scanned the audience. She spotted Mrs. Harrison in the 5th row with her husband. David was there too, sitting up straight, looking nervous for her. The piano dealer was there, the music academy owner. Even some of her old cleaning clients had come, people she used to work for. 5 minutes, the stage manager called. Margaret closed her eyes and thought about Robert. He would have loved this. He would have been in the front row, beaming with pride. She wished he could see her now, could know that the piano hadn't been sold for nothing, that his death hadn't stolen her music forever. "This one's for you," she whispered to his memory. The lights dimmed in the audience. The orchestra fell silent. Maestro Chen walked out onto the stage to thunderous applause. He bowed, turned to the orchestra, and raised his baton. The introduction began, strings and horns building the emotional foundation. Then Margaret walked onto the stage. The applause that greeted her was overwhelming. It went on, people standing, whistling, cheering. She had to wait almost 2 minutes for it to die down. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, positioned her hands. Maestro Chen looked at her. She nodded. He brought the orchestra back in, and when her cue came, Margaret's hands came down on the keys. From the first note, she knew it was going to be okay. Better than okay. The fear fell away. The doubt disappeared. There was only the music, pouring out of her like it had been waiting all these years to be released. The orchestra swelled around her, supporting her, lifting her higher. She played like she had never played before. Not even in her youth, when she had technique but not wisdom. Now she had both. She played with the understanding that comes from loss, with the joy that comes from second chances, with the gratitude of someone who knows how precious and fragile beautiful moments can be. In the audience, people were crying. Mrs. Harrison had tears streaming down her face. David was leaning forward in his seat, completely transfixed. The piano dealer was mouthing yes over and over. Even people who had never listened to classical music before found themselves moved by something they couldn't quite name. The piece built to its climax. Margaret's hands flying across the keys, the orchestra crashing around her like waves. She felt powerful and free and completely alive. This was who she was. This was who she had always been, underneath the years of scrubbing and serving and making herself small. The final notes rang out. Margaret's hands lifted from the keys. For a moment the hall was silent. Then the audience erupted. They were on their feet immediately. Applause like thunder, whistles and cheers and shouts of, "Bravo!" Margaret stood and bowed, tears streaming down her face. Maestro Chen was grinning at her, applauding along with everyone else. The orchestra members were tapping their instruments in approval. She bowed again and again. The applause wouldn't stop. Finally, Maestro Chen gestured to the piano, asking if she would play an encore. The audience roared their approval. Margaret sat back down and played a simple piece this time. One of Robert's favorites, a Chopin nocturne. She played it quietly, intimately, like she was playing just for him. The audience listened in breathless silence, understanding that they were witnessing something sacred. When it ended, the applause was softer but somehow deeper. Margaret walked off the stage to a standing ovation that lasted 15 minutes. Backstage, she was mobbed by well-wishers. Maestro Chen hugged her, lifting her off her feet. "You were magnificent. Absolutely magnificent." The orchestra member shook her hand, congratulated her, told her it was an honor to play with her. Mrs. Harrison and David found her eventually. Mrs. Harrison hugged her tight. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for reminding me that every person has value, that everyone deserves to be seen." David just stood there with tears on his face. "You were amazing," he managed to say. Margaret smiled at him. "Thank you. For everything. Even the cruel parts." The reviews came out the next day and they were glowing. One critic called it the most moving performance of Rachmaninoff I have heard in 20 years. Another wrote, "Margaret proved that talent doesn't have an expiration date, and that circumstances can't kill what lives in the soul." Offers started pouring in. Other orchestras wanted her to perform with them. Recording studios wanted to produce an album. Universities wanted her to teach. At 62 years old, Margaret suddenly had more opportunities than she had ever had in her 20s. She chose carefully. She accepted some performances and teaching positions. But she also made sure to keep time for herself, for practice, for simply enjoying music without pressure. She had learned the hard way that success means nothing if you lose yourself in the process. 6 months after the concert, Margaret moved into a larger apartment, one with room for her piano and a window that got good morning light. She hung the photograph of her younger self on the wall, but next to it, she hung a new photograph from the concert. 2 versions of herself, 35 years apart, both doing what they loved. She never forgot what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, overlooked, treated as less than human. Because of that, she treated everyone she met with dignity and respect. The young person serving her coffee, the custodian cleaning the concert hall, the student struggling with a difficult piece. She saw them all, and sometimes, late at night when she was alone with her piano, Margaret played for Robert. She played for the woman she used to be. She played for everyone who had ever given up their dreams because life got hard. But mostly she played for herself. For the girl who fell in love with music in Moscow. For the young woman who came to America chasing dreams. For the widow who survived the hardest years by making herself small. For all the versions of herself that had led to this moment. Because the truth was simple and profound. She had never stopped being a musician, even when she was holding a mop instead of sitting at a piano. The music had always been inside her, waiting patiently for the moment when she would be ready to let it out again. And now, finally, she was free. Margaret stood there in her gray uniform, surrounded by people in gowns and tuxedos, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. 6 months. That's what Maestro Chen was offering. 6 months to prepare for a performance that could either redeem everything she had lost, or prove that those 10 years had stolen her gift forever. "I need time to think," she finally said, her voice barely audible. Maestro Chen reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But please call me, even if you just want to talk." Margaret took the card with shaking hands. It was heavy stock paper, the kind that cost money. His name was embossed in gold lettering. The party was essentially over now. Nobody wanted to drink champagne or make small talk after what they had just witnessed. Guests started making their way to the exit, but many stopped to speak to Margaret first. They shook her hand. Some of them hugged her, told her how moved they were. A few slipped folded bills into her palm when they thought nobody was looking. She was too overwhelmed to refuse. The piano dealer wrote his address on the back of a receipt and pressed it into her hand. "Come by next week. We'll get you set up with a proper instrument." The music academy owner did the same. "Our practice rooms are available from 6 to 10 every evening. Come whenever you want, for as long as you want." One by one, they filed out into the night, leaving Margaret standing in the middle of the empty ballroom. Her feet ached. Her back hurt. But something else hurt too, something deeper. a hurt that came from being seen again after so many years of being invisible. Mrs. Harrison approached slowly. She had removed her high heels and was carrying them in one hand. Her perfect hair had come loose from its pins. "Margaret, I don't know what to say. I've employed you for 5 years and I never bothered to learn anything about you. I never asked about your life, your history. You were just the maid to me." "That's what I was," Margaret said simply. "That's what you paid me to be. But you were so much more." Mrs. Harrison's voice cracked. "You are so much more. And I'm ashamed that it took my son's cruelty to make us realize it." Speaking of David, he emerged from wherever he had been hiding. His earlier confidence was completely gone. He looked young suddenly and scared. "I'm sorry," he said, not quite meeting Margaret's eyes. "I thought it would be funny. I thought you'd play some basic song and we'd all have a laugh." "You didn't think I was a real person," Margaret finished for him. "You thought I was just entertainment. Something to mock." David flinched like she had slapped him. "You're right. I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry." Margaret looked at this young man who had never struggled for anything in his life, who had treated her like furniture for 5 years. Part of her wanted to stay angry, but mostly she just felt tired. "What you did tonight was cruel," she said quietly. "But if you hadn't done it, I might have gone the rest of my life without touching a piano again. So I don't know if I should thank you or hate you." She left them standing there and made her way to the kitchen. There were still dishes to wash, floors to sweep, a job to finish. Mrs. Harrison called after her, saying she could leave, that she had done enough. But Margaret needed the familiar routine. She needed her hands in soapy water, needed the simple task of cleaning up after other people. It helped her think. 2 hours later, the kitchen was spotless. Margaret hung up her apron, collected her purse, and walked out to her old car in the parking area reserved for staff. It was almost midnight. The stars were out, bright and cold. She sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine. Maestro Chen's card was in her purse. The addresses for the piano dealership and the music academy were folded in her pocket. Proof that tonight had really happened, that she hadn't imagined it. The drive home took 40 minutes. She lived in a small apartment in the older part of town, the kind of building where the heat never worked quite right and you could hear your neighbors through the walls. It was all she could afford on a maid's salary. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her unit, her legs protesting every step. Inside, her apartment was dark and quiet. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a living room barely big enough for a couch. The walls were mostly bare. She had learned not to put up too many decorations because it just made the space feel more depressing. But in the corner, she had 1 photograph in a frame. It showed a young woman in a concert gown, standing next to a grand piano holding a bouquet of yellow roses. She was smiling like she had just been given the world. That young woman was her 35 years ago after a performance in Chicago, the night she met Robert. Margaret picked up the frame and sat on her couch, studying the photograph in the dim light from the street lamp outside. She barely recognized herself. That woman had been so confident, so sure of her place in the world. What had happened to her? Life happened, she thought. Loss happened. Bills happened. Survival happened. She fell asleep on the couch, still holding the photograph. The next morning, Margaret called in sick to work. She never called in sick. In 5 years, she had never missed a single day. But she couldn't face going back to the Harrison estate yet. Couldn't face the questions and the pity and the way everything had changed. Instead, she walked to the address the piano dealer had given her. It took an hour on foot because she didn't want to waste money on a bus. The store was in the wealthy part of downtown, with a huge glass window displaying pianos that probably cost more than her car. She almost turned around and left. This was crazy. She was a maid. She had no business here. But then the door opened and the dealer was there, the man from the party. "Margaret, I hoped you would come. Please come in." Inside, the store smelled like wood polish and possibility. There were pianos everywhere, uprights and grands, black and white, new and vintage. The dealer led her to a Yamaha grand piano in the back corner. "This one just came in," he said, running his hand lovingly over the glossy surface. Previous owner barely played it. "It's been sitting in a living room for 15 years, almost like new. It's yours if you want it." "I can't afford this," Margaret said immediately. "I'm not asking you to buy it," he said gently. "Consider it a loan. You can return it whenever you want, but I have a feeling you won't want to." Margaret sat down at the bench. Her hands found the keys. She played a simple scale, then a chord progression, then a few bars of a Mozart sonata. The piano sang under her fingers, perfectly tuned, perfectly balanced. When can you deliver it? She heard herself asking. The piano arrived at her apartment that afternoon. It took 4 men to get it up the stairs. It barely fit through her door. In her tiny living room, it looked enormous, completely out of place. But when Margaret sat down and started to play, it felt like the only thing in the room that mattered. Her neighbors probably hated her. The walls were thin, and she played for 3 hours straight that first day, her fingers remembering pieces she thought she had forgotten. Bach and Beethoven and Chopin and Rachmaninoff, all of it came flooding back like it had been waiting inside her all these years. Over the next few days, Margaret established a new routine. She worked her morning cleaning jobs, came home, and practiced until her fingers ached. She went to the music academy and used their practice rooms in the evenings. She pulled out old sheet music she had kept in a box under her bed, yellowed with age but still readable. A week after the party, she called Maestro Chen. "I'll audition," she told him. "I don't know if I can do it, but I want to try." His joy was evident even over the phone. "Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. When can you come to the Symphony Hall?" They scheduled the audition for 2 weeks out. That gave Margaret time to practice, to shake off the rust, to remember what it felt like to perform. She was terrified. She hadn't auditioned for anything in decades. What if she failed? What if that performance at the party had been a fluke? Adrenaline and muscle memory combining for one perfect moment that she could never recreate. But she practiced anyway, every spare moment. Her hands developed new calluses, different from the ones she got from cleaning. Her back hurt from sitting at the piano for hours. Her neighbors complained to the landlord about the noise. She didn't care. Mrs. Harrison called several times. Margaret didn't answer. She needed space from that world, needed to figure out who she was outside of being someone's maid. Finally, Mrs. Harrison sent a text message. "I understand if you don't want to work for us anymore, but please know that the job is yours as long as you want it. And if you need anything at all, please ask." Margaret didn't respond. She was too busy practicing. The night before the audition, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside her window, sirens and car horns and the rumble of the subway, the sounds of life going on while she tried to restart her own. Margaret tried to move toward the kitchen, but people were pressing in around her. Hands reached out to touch her arm, to shake her hand, to stop her from leaving. The applause continued, getting louder if anything. Someone was whistling. Someone else was shouting, "Bravo." She felt dizzy. The room seemed to spin around her. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to embarrass herself, prove she was just a maid, just someone who cleaned toilets and scrubbed floors. Then she could have gone back to being invisible. Back to being safe. But now everyone was looking at her. Really looking at her. And she didn't know how to handle it. An older man pushed through the crowd. Margaret's breath caught in her throat when she saw his face. It was Maestro Chen, the director of the city's symphony orchestra. She had seen his picture in the paper, had even heard him speak at a concert years ago, back when she could still afford tickets to things like that. Excuse me, he was saying, making his way toward her. His eyes were wide with excitement. "Please, let me through." When he reached her, he took both her hands in his. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Absolutely extraordinary. I have heard professional pianists who couldn't play that piece half as well as you just did." Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. What could she say? How could she explain? "Where did you train?" Maestro Chen asked. "Juilliard, Curtis?" "You must tell me." The crowd had gone quiet again, everyone leaning in to hear her answer. Margaret looked down at their joined hands. His were soft and well cared for. Hers were rough with calluses and scars, from years of scrubbing and cleaning. "Moscow. Conservatory," she finally whispered. The gasp that went through the room was almost funny. Almost. The Moscow Conservatory was one of the most prestigious music schools in the entire world. Only the most talented students got accepted. Only the truly gifted graduated. Moscow? Mrs. Harrison's voice cut through the murmurs. She had moved closer, her face a mixture of confusion and something else Margaret couldn't quite read. "I don't understand. You're a concert pianist? Then why are you working as a maid?" Margaret pulled her hands away from Maestro Chen's gentle grip. She wrapped her arms around herself. suddenly cold despite the warmth of all these bodies pressed close. This was the moment she had been avoiding for 10 years. The moment when she had to say it out loud, make it real again. "I was a concert pianist," she said quietly. "A long time ago." "But that doesn't make sense," someone in the crowd said. "If you graduated from Moscow Conservatory, you could have any position you wanted. You could be teaching at a university, playing in orchestras. Life doesn't always work out the way you plan." Margaret interrupted, her voice stronger now. "I came to America 35 years ago on a performance tour. I was 27 years old. I had just finished a series of concerts in Europe, and my manager arranged for me to play in New York, Chicago, San Francisco. It was supposed to be the start of my international career." She paused, lost in the memory. The room was so quiet you could hear the fountain outside through the open windows. "In Chicago, I met a man named Robert," she continued. "He came to my concert. Afterward, he waited by the stage door with flowers. Yellow roses. He said he'd never heard anything so beautiful in his life." A small smile crossed her face. "We talked for 3 hours that night. 3 hours that felt like 3 minutes." Mrs. Harrison had tears in her eyes. Margaret noticed with surprise. She had never seen the woman show real emotion before. "I fell in love," Margaret said simply. "By the end of the tour, I knew I couldn't leave. I applied for a visa, found an agent in America, started building a new career here. Robert and I got married a year later. For a while, everything was perfect. I was playing concerts, teaching private students, living the life I had always dreamed of." "What happened?" someone asked softly. Margaret's smile faded. "Robert got sick, cancer. It started in his lungs and spread everywhere. The treatments were expensive. So expensive. Insurance didn't cover half of it. We spent everything we had. I sold my piano to pay for experimental treatments that didn't work. I canceled concerts to take care of him. And then he died anyway." She heard people crying now. Not just one or two. Several of them. These wealthy people in their expensive clothes, crying for a story they had never bothered to ask about before. "After the funeral, I had nothing left," Margaret said. "No money, no piano, no career." "I was 52 years old. Too old to start over as a concert pianist. Even if I could have afforded a new instrument. The music world moves on quickly. If you're gone for a few years, people forget you existed. So I did what I had to do to survive. I cleaned houses." The silence that followed was heavy with guilt. Margaret could feel it pressing down on all of them. These people who had more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes, looking at a woman who had lost everything and had to scrub their toilets to pay rent. "I never stopped being a pianist in my heart," Margaret added quietly, "but there wasn't room for that anymore. I had bills to pay. I had to eat. Pride doesn't fill your stomach, so I became invisible. I learned to blend into the background, to not be noticed. It was easier that way." David had somehow ended up near the back of the crowd. His face was white as a sheet. His friends had disappeared entirely, probably slipping out while everyone was focused on Margaret. He looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. "I haven't touched a piano in 10 years, Margaret said, looking at the instrument that had just betrayed all her secrets. "I sold mine in 2015. Since then, I've walked past music stores and closed my ears. I've cleaned around pianos in houses like this one and never let myself look at them too closely. Because if I did, if I let myself remember what it felt like to play, I thought it might break me completely." "Then why did you play tonight?" Maestro Chen asked gently. Margaret let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it wasn't so sad. "Because I didn't have a choice. Because David insisted and Mrs. Harrison agreed, and I couldn't say no without losing my job. Because I needed to remind myself why I gave it up in the first place." She looked around at all these faces staring at her with pity and admiration and guilt. "But when my hands touched those keys, everything came back. Every lesson, every practice session, every performance. Every moment of joy I felt when I was young and believed I could change the world with music. It all came flooding back like it had been waiting there the whole time, just beneath the surface." Maestro Chen was nodding vigorously. "It was there. Anyone listening could hear it. You still have that gift. It hasn't left you. Gifts don't pay rent," Margaret said simply. "But they should," a woman's voice said. Margaret turned to see a woman in a silver gown stepping forward. She recognized her as the owner of the biggest music academy in the city. "We have practice rooms that sit empty most evenings. You could use them. Free of charge. And I have 3 grand pianos in my warehouse right now," another man added. He owned a piano dealership. Margaret had seen his commercials on TV. You can have one. No cost. Wait, Maestro Chen said, holding up his hands. Before we get ahead of ourselves, I need to ask you something, Margaret. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. We're performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in 6 months. Our soloist just informed me she's pregnant and can't perform. We've been scrambling to find a replacement. Would you consider auditioning? Margaret stared at him. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. I couldn't possibly, she whispered. I'm 62 years old. I haven't performed in years. I'm not— You just played that piece perfectly after not touching a piano for a decade, Maestro Chen interrupted. Do you know how rare that is? How much talent that requires? Most pianists practice that piece for months and still make mistakes. You played it like you were born to play it. But I'm nobody now, Margaret protested. I'm just a maid. Nobody would come to see me play. Mrs. Harrison stepped forward then. Her mascara was running down her face from crying, making dark tracks through her expensive makeup. You were never just a maid, she said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that we made you feel that way. That we never saw you. Margaret felt her own tears starting to fall now. She had held them back for so long through so many hard years, but now they came like a dam breaking. I see you now, Mrs. Harrison continued. We all see you now. And I think everyone in this room would be honored to watch you perform. The crowd erupted in agreement. People were nodding, calling out yes, and absolutely. Someone started clapping again and others joined in. Margaret looked around at all these faces. Some of them she had served drinks to earlier tonight. Some of them she had cleaned house for over the years. They were strangers, really. But right now, in this moment, they looked at her like she mattered, like she was more than just the help. Maestro Chen was still waiting for her answer, his eyes hopeful. Margaret stood in front of the piano, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The instrument was even more beautiful up close. The wood was so polished she could see her reflection in it, warped and uncertain. Her hands, rough and red from years of cleaning, hovered at her sides. She didn't belong here, standing in front of this expensive piano in her gray uniform, while wealthy people watched and waited for her to fail. Behind her, she could hear David and his friends whispering and giggling. Someone's phone camera clicked. She closed her eyes and took a breath that felt like it might be her last. Slowly, she sat down on the velvet bench. It was softer than anything she owned. Her worn black shoes looked ridiculous next to the piano's elegant legs. She could smell the champagne on people's breath, the expensive perfume, the flowers that decorated every surface. The air felt thick and heavy. Her fingers touched the keys just barely. They were cool and smooth under her calloused fingertips. She hadn't felt piano keys in 10 years. 10 long years since she had sold her own piano to pay for her husband's funeral. 10 years since she had let this part of herself die because survival mattered more than dreams. The room was so quiet now she could hear her own heartbeat. She could feel everyone staring at her back, waiting for the embarrassment to begin. David probably had his phone pointed right at her, ready to capture every awkward moment. She imagined the video going online. People laughing at the old maid who thought she could play piano. The comments would be cruel. They always were, but something was happening inside her. Something she had buried so deep she thought it was gone forever. Her fingers found their position on the keys, muscle memory taking over after all these years. She could almost hear her old teacher's voice from the conservatory, all those decades ago in Moscow. Posture first, breathing second, then let the music come. Margaret straightened her back. She took another breath, and then she began to play. The first note rang out, pure and clear as a bell. Then another, and another. Within seconds, her hands were moving across the keys like they had never stopped. Like the 10-year gap had been just a brief pause. She was playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most difficult pieces ever written. The music poured out of her, filling the massive ballroom with sound that made the chandelier crystals tremble. The laughter behind her died instantly. Margaret's whole body seemed to change as she played. The tiredness fell away. Her shoulders squared. Her movements became fluid and confident. This wasn't someone who had learned a few songs from YouTube videos. This was a master at work, someone who had spent thousands upon thousands of hours perfecting their craft. The music swelled and dipped, carried emotion through the room like waves. It was powerful and delicate at the same time. It was heartbreak and joy and longing all mixed together. People who had been talking about stock prices and vacation homes suddenly found themselves fighting back tears. Women who never cried in public felt their eyes getting wet. Men who prided themselves on being tough had goosebumps running down their arms. David's phone slowly lowered. His mouth hung open. The smirk had completely disappeared from his face. Next to him, his friends stood frozen, looking like they had just witnessed something they couldn't quite understand. The joke they had been so eager to enjoy had turned into something else entirely, something that made them feel small and ashamed. Mrs. Harrison's champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. She stared at Margaret's back with an expression that mixed shock with something else. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that she had completely misjudged the woman who had been cleaning her house for 5 years. Around the room, conversations had stopped mid-sentence. People who had been checking their phones put them away. Couples who had been standing apart moved closer together, drawn by the intimacy of the music. The mayor was there, and the city's wealthiest businessman, and the owner of the biggest tech company in the region, and not one of them could look away. Margaret's fingers flew over the keys, hitting notes that most pianists struggled with even after months of practice. Her left hand maintained the deep, rolling bass while her right hand danced through the melody. The piece was incredibly complex, with passages that required both hands to move independently in different rhythms. But Margaret played it like she was breathing, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The music told a story. You could hear it even if you didn't know anything about classical music. It spoke of love and loss, of dreams that died and maybe could be reborn. It spoke of years of silence and the relief of finally having a voice again. Every person in that room heard something different in those notes, but they all heard something that touched them. A woman near the back started crying openly. Her husband put his arm around her, his own eyes suspiciously bright. An older man who had made his fortune in banking and hadn't thought about beauty in years found himself transported back to a memory of his mother playing piano when he was a child. A young woman who had been bored at yet another society party suddenly understood why people said music could change your life. Margaret was lost in it now. Her eyes were closed. Her face had transformed from the tired, careful mask she always wore into something open and alive. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about bills or rent or her aching back, or the fact that she was 62 years old and cleaning toilets for a living. She was just music. She was every hour she had practiced as a young girl in Moscow. She was every performance she had given before life took it all away. She was every dream she had buried and forgotten. The concerto built toward its climax. Margaret's hands moved faster, the notes cascading over each other like water. The music got louder, more insistent, demanding to be heard. Her whole body swayed with it, feeling every chord in her bones. This was what she had been made for. This was who she really was underneath the years of making herself invisible. David backed away from the piano slowly, his face pale. He looked like he might be sick. Next to him, his friend who had laughed the loudest looked down at his expensive shoes, unable to meet anyone's eyes. They had wanted to humiliate her. They had wanted to prove she was nothing, just the help, someone they could mock for their entertainment. Instead, she had proven something else entirely. The piece moved into its quieter middle section, and Margaret's playing became gentle, almost tender. It was like watching someone handle something precious and fragile. Every note was perfectly placed, every pause exactly the right length. She played with feeling that only comes from truly understanding what the music means, from having lived through the emotions it describes. In the crowd, people were having realizations. The music teacher who gave lessons to rich kids for $200 an hour knew she was hearing something she could never achieve herself. The man who collected rare pianos understood he was witnessing a level of mastery money couldn't buy. The women who had been laughing about Margaret just minutes before felt their faces burning with shame. Mrs. Harrison set down her glass carefully, like she was afraid any sound might break the spell. She looked at Margaret, really looked at her for the first time in 5 years. Not as the maid, not as the invisible woman who cleaned her house, but as a person with a history and talents and dreams that had nothing to do with mopping floors. The music built again toward the finale. Margaret's hands pounded the keys now, drawing out every bit of emotion the piano could give. The sound filled the room, filled the whole house, seemed to fill the whole world. It was triumphant and sad at the same time, like someone finally being seen after years of being invisible. And then, with one final cascading run down the keys, it ended. The last notes hung in the air, shimmering like heat off summer pavement. Margaret's hand stayed on the keys for a moment longer, like she couldn't quite bear to let go. Her shoulders rose and fell with her breathing. When she finally opened her eyes, she looked almost surprised to find herself back in the Harrisons' ballroom, surrounded by wealthy strangers in their fancy clothes. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The entire room seemed frozen in time, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Then someone started clapping. Slowly at first, then faster. Then someone else joined in. And then suddenly the whole room erupted in applause. Not the polite golf clap kind of applause these people usually gave. Real applause. The kind that makes your hands hurt. The kind that comes from being genuinely moved by something you weren't expecting. Margaret stood up from the piano bench, her legs shaky. Her face was flushed. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She tried to slip away, to return to being invisible, to go back to the kitchen where she belonged. But the crowd wasn't letting her go. Margaret's hands were deep in soapy water when she heard the first cars pulling up the long driveway. She glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. 4 p.m, right on schedule. The guests would start arriving soon, and she still had so much to do. She dried her hands on her apron and looked out the window. The estate stretched out before her like something from a magazine. Perfectly trimmed hedges, fountains that sparkled in the afternoon sun, and gardens that seemed to go on forever. White tables with matching chairs had been set up on the lawn, each one decorated with flowers that probably cost more than her weekly salary. Margaret had been working at the Harrison estate for 5 years now. 5 years of early mornings and late nights. 5 years of scrubbing floors that were already clean and polishing silver that already gleamed. But it was steady work, and at 62 years old, she couldn't afford to be picky. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, checking on the caterers, making sure the champagne glasses were spotless, arranging the desserts on crystal platters. Her body ached in the way it always did after a long day, but she pushed through it. She always did. Through the swinging door, she could hear voices in the main hall. Mrs. Harrison was greeting the early arrivals, her laugh echoing off the marble floors. That woman had a laugh that could fill a room, confident and loud. Margaret had heard it 1,000 times, but never directed at her. To Mrs. Harrison, Margaret was just part of the furniture. Useful, necessary, but not really worth noticing. The evening was going to be big. Mrs. Harrison had been planning this charity gala for months, talking about it constantly on her phone calls, changing her mind about the menu at least 12 times. 50 of the city's wealthiest families were coming. Politicians, business owners, people who wore watches that cost more than cars. Margaret had learned all their names over the years, though none of them had ever bothered to learn hers. She carried a tray of champagne flutes into the ballroom and stopped for just a moment to take it in. The room was stunning. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals catching the light and throwing rainbows across the walls. The floors were so polished you could see your reflection, and in the corner, sitting like a sleeping giant, was the grand piano. Black and glossy, its lid propped open, waiting for someone to bring it to life. Margaret felt something twist in her chest when she looked at that piano. She quickly turned away and focused on arranging the glasses on the bar. More guests started arriving. The women wore gowns that probably took months to make, covered in beads and sequins that sparkled with every movement. The men wore tuxedos that fit them perfectly, expensive watches glinting on their wrists. They air-kissed each other and made small talk about their recent vacations to places Margaret had only seen in pictures. She moved between them like a ghost, refilling drinks, clearing away empty plates, making sure everything ran smoothly. Nobody looked at her. Nobody thanked her. She was invisible, and she had gotten used to it a long time ago. By 7 o'clock, the party was in full swing. The ballroom was packed with people laughing and talking, their voices blending together into a constant buzz. Margaret's feet hurt and her back was killing her, but she kept moving. There were still hours to go. Mrs. Harrison stood near the piano, holding court with a group of women who all seemed to be trying to outdo each other with stories about their children's accomplishments. Her son David was there too, lounging on one of the velvet couches with his friends. He was 28 years old and had never worked a real job in his life. His father's money had seen to that. Margaret had watched David grow up over the past 5 years. She had cleaned up after his parties, washed his clothes when he was too lazy to send them to the dry cleaner, picked up the messes he left around the house. He had never once said thank you. In fact, he barely acknowledged her existence unless he wanted something. Tonight he was drunk. She could tell from the way he was laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny, and the way his movements were just a little too loose. His friends were the same way. Rich boys who had never been told no, who thought the world existed for their entertainment. Margaret was in the kitchen loading dirty plates into the dishwasher when she heard someone call her name. Well, not her name exactly. "Hey, maid lady." It was David's voice coming from the ballroom. She wiped her hands and walked back into the party, her heart sinking a little. Nothing good ever came from David wanting her attention. He was standing near the piano now, swaying slightly, a champagne glass in his hand. His friends were grouped around him, all of them grinning like they were in on some private joke. Several other guests had turned to look, curious about what was happening. "There you are," David said when he saw her. His voice was too loud, the way drunk people's voices always are. "Come here for a second." Margaret walked over slowly, keeping her eyes down. Years of working in houses like this had taught her to make herself as small as possible, especially when the wealthy were looking for entertainment. "We were just talking," David continued, gesturing broadly with his glass and nearly spilling champagne on the carpet. "You've worked for us for what, 5 years? And we don't know anything about you. That's crazy, right?" His friend snickered. Margaret could feel more eyes turning toward them. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, but she stayed rooted to the spot. "I mean, you're here all the time, cleaning our house, cooking our food, but we never talk to you," David went on. He was enjoying this, she realized. Enjoying having an audience. "So tell us something interesting about yourself. Do you have any hobbies? Any secret talents?" Margaret's mouth felt dry. "Sir, I should really get back to work." "There are dishes. The dishes can wait," David interrupted. He turned to his mother, who was watching with an amused expression on her face. "Mom, don't you think our staff should be more well-rounded? More cultured?" Mrs. Harrison smiled, sipping her champagne. "What exactly are you suggesting, David?" David's grin widened. He gestured toward the piano. "Well, we were supposed to have a pianist tonight, but she canceled. Left us in the lurch. And I was thinking, maybe Margaret here has hidden musical talents. Maybe she can play for us." The group around him burst into laughter. Not kind laughter. The mean kind. The kind that made Margaret's cheeks burn. "Oh, David, don't be ridiculous," one of his friends said, but he was laughing too hard to sound sincere. "I'm serious," David insisted, playing up the joke. "Margaret, can you play the piano?" Margaret stood there, frozen. Every instinct told her to say no, to excuse herself, to get away from this moment that was clearly designed to humiliate her. But she could feel everyone watching, waiting. "I really don't think," she started. "It's just one song," David pressed. "Consider it part of tonight's service. We're paying you overtime anyway, right? So entertain our guests. Show us what you've got." More people were gathering now, drawn by the commotion. Margaret saw Mrs. Harrison exchange glances with some of the other women, all of them clearly finding this amusing.